set up. I have the challenge, the great challenge, it's a little delicate, of introducing my boss, who will then introduce our closing plenary speakers. So, of course, my boss is University of Texas President Greg Fenves, and his very impressive bio is known to all of us here. But just two things I want to highlight. The first is during his first several months as the university president, President Fenves has been really forward-leaning on the role of the university in a free society and on civic engagement and on making sure that UT's mission is not just confined here to the 40 acres, but to engagement with the city of Austin, with the state of Texas, and of course with our nation and with our world. And the second thing very particular to us today is President Fenves has been a huge supporter of the Strauss Center, of the Clements Center, of the Intelligence Studies Project, and of our efforts on national security. Bobby and I wouldn't be able to do our jobs without him. Steve Slick wouldn't even be here without President Fenves. And so he's made a real personal commitment to elevating UT Austin's role as a leading university in national security studies. So please join me in welcoming President Greg Fenves.
All right, well, good morning, and thank you, Will, for that kind introduction. It's great to see everybody here this morning on such an important topic to our nation and to the entire world. I'd like to also recognize U.S. Senator Ben Sasse. I think he stepped out, but he has been participating fully in this incredible conference. The topics that have been covered in the conference are not only weighty and important to the nation, they are extremely timely. And I know this wasn't part of the scheduling for the conference, but looking at the terrorist attacks in Paris, what's going on in Western Europe and Belgium today, reinforces the point of how significant the threats are to the country and to the world. And it's only through the kind of thoughtful scholarship and thinking that can take place at a university like the University of Texas, where we can bring intellectual resources from many different disciplines, from history, policy, military studies, understanding the role of technology in modern national security, and bring those together, convene those in forums like we have here today, to understand where we're going to go forward and how we are going to protect national security. And as Will had mentioned, I'm so pleased with the progress the Clements Center has made in a very short time, thanks to Will's leadership. The Strauss Center, that has been an active presence on this campus for many years, and would like to acknowledge Bobby Chesney's role in reinvigorating the role of the Strauss Center and how the Strauss and the Clements Center are working together to deal with these critical issues. And we could not have a better closing speaker at this conference than the senator from the great state of Texas, Senator John Cornyn. Let's give the senator a round of applause. Senator Cornyn has been a thoughtful leader in the U.S. Senate, an important source of sound ideas and policies for the country, and he serves the state of Texas in an admirable way. He now represents Texas in his third term in the U.S. Senate, where he serves on the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And recognizing his leadership in the Senate in 2014, Senate Republicans elected him the majority whip for the 114th Congress. Prior to his election to the Senate, he is well known in the state of Texas for his service as a district judge, justice on the Texas Supreme Court, and just prior to election to the Senate as the Attorney General for the state of Texas. Senator Cornyn is a great friend of the university, not just because he likes to come to UT, and I know he does, but he recognizes the value the University of Texas has for every citizen in the state of Texas, and that is something that we strive to do every single day. Following the senator's speech, Admiral Bob Inman, another great friend of the university, a longtime member of our faculty and leader, the campus, will join the senator on stage for a follow-up conversation to conclude the forum. Please welcome Senator John Cornyn.
Good morning. It's great to be with all of you. And Greg, thank you for that very nice introduction. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here this morning as a result of this wonderful collaboration here at the University of Texas. Two great Texans, two great Americans, and the institutions named after them have come together in a remarkable sort of way. I guess they could have been rivals, but they decided to collaborate and work together. And I think the result with this incredible intelligence studies project and the sort of talent and resources that it draws is really a crown jewel and something we ought to all applaud. And Greg, I just am very happy that the University of Texas has decided to take on this project. And it's nice to have people talking about these sorts of issues in places other than the East Coast. And I know a lot of our great talent, former CIA directors and others like to come to Austin, Texas and enjoy the intellectual stimulation as well as the good food and the company here in Austin. So it is really great to be part of this program, of course, with Admiral Inman, who I've known for many years, and Admiral McRaven, the new Chancellor of the University of Texas. You've got a lot of homegrown talent here in the national security arena. And my friend Michael McCall, I know you heard from last night, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House. I'm proud of the fact I lured Michael back to Austin when I was Attorney General, and he worked as head of my criminal division before he took a wrong step and ran for Congress. But he's made me proud of his great service there, and he served with such great distinction. And then Ben Sass, who represents the new class of 2014 in the United States Senate, who is a brilliant, thoughtful guy and somebody who I'm proud to call colleague and friend. I thought I would let the Clements Center's mission guide my remarks today and focus on history, strategy, and statecraft. So let me first give a little bit of a historical perspective on how I believe that America has ceded its leadership role and lost credibility in the world in recent years. Next, I'll discuss what I think the next administration can do to restore that credibility and our essential role as the world's leading superpower, namely longer-term strategic thinking and a fulsome consideration of the tools of statecraft at our disposal. Let me describe what I believe to be a disturbing trend in American foreign policy, characterized by retreat over leadership and avoidance over engagement. Now, I'm a recovering lawyer, you'll have to forgive me, but let me unpack the evidence to support those rather dramatic statements. In 2007, the United States was at a crossroads in Iraq. Congress was faced with two options: force the president to precipitously withdraw troops from the country, a country whose leader we had toppled 4 years earlier, or to double down, adopt a clear hold and build counterinsurgency strategy. And of course, that was in addition to the counterterrorism strategy led by our elite special forces, and confront the erupting violence head on. Of course, the latter option became known as the surge, led by General David Petraeus, a high-risk strategy that happened to pay off. I voted for more than once against efforts to undermine the surge, deferring to the best judgment of our military leaders and refusing to give up on the chance to provide the Iraqi people with a better future, especially after the sacrifice of so much American blood and treasure. Not surprisingly, running for President of the United States, the incoming candidate for president disagreed with the policy choices of his predecessor, including the surge. If elected, he said he would responsibly end the war in Iraq. Instead, we saw the withdrawal from Iraq squander the hard-won progress achieved by the surge. And over the past 2 years, ISIS has captured city after city where American troops shed blood, sweat, and tears to bring relative peace in the years preceding our withdrawal. Now, I often think about how heartbreaking it must be to the veterans in the United States military who fought, lost friends, and fellow service members in places like Mosul, Fallujah, and Ramadi. And I also think about those people who I've visited who carry both the visible and not visible wounds of their military service in Iraq. And I even think about the Gold Star mothers that lost sons and daughters in service to our country in those fights. Today, we know the Iraq War has not been responsibly ended. We have 3,500, approximately, at least, Americans boots on the ground, and ISIS occupies large portions of the country. The border between Syria and Iraq is gone. Iranian influence is mushroomed, and the future of a unitary Iraq is in serious doubt. But of course, American retreat is not just about Iraq. We see American leadership receding around the world. In Europe, we see an aggressive Russia operating with near impunity, threatening its former Soviet satellites, members of NATO, no less, and invading a sovereign neighbor, Ukraine, with some eerie similarities to the events leading up to World War II. This blatant disregard for international law in NATO's backyard has been met with a half-hearted response. I recall the Ukrainian president coming to speak to a joint session of the United States Congress, basically saying, thanks for the blankets, but making the obvious point that they needed a far more robust response in terms of arms and supplies, a response that never came. And despite sanctions, we see that Russia has challenged America's interests far afield from just Europe. After incredibly claiming the role of as honest broker among world powers and Bashar al-Assad in the removal of chemical weapons from Syria, today, Russia is bombing forces aligned with the United States. So how is this possible? Well, Russia has no reason to believe that the United States, under this administration, will challenge its aggressive support for Iran and Assad in the region. I would love to be wrong. Unfortunately, leading from behind has only emboldened Russia. And then there's Asia. We find an increasingly aggressive China, one that seeks to not just expand its existing territory, but literally to create new territory in the South China Sea. We see a nuclear North Korea that continues to threaten our ally South Korea and the rest of the world with an alarming supply of short and long-range ballistic missiles. The long-range variety, by the way, has the potential to even hit the United States. One reason we need to take North Korean threats seriously. Admiral Harry Harris, the commander of Pacific Command, told me and some of my colleagues in August when we visited his headquarters that North Korea tops his list of security concerns, a combination of nukes, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and an erratic, unbalanced leader who claims that North Korea is in a quasi-state of war. Beyond Asia, we see threats popping up on almost every continent, and in countries where the United States has intentionally scaled back our footprint. You remember Libya? Well, Muammar Gaddafi was deposed in a civil war in 2011, in a civil war to which NATO offered its support, including notably the United States. I remember asking Secretary Gates at the time what America's national interests were at stake in Libya. And Secretary Gates, for whom I have enormous respect, was, to my mind, a little visibly unsettled as he tried to be the good soldier and support the administration's decision. I was comforted by his memoir he wrote after he left, where I looked in the index and he happened to recount that particular incident where I questioned him from my perch on the Senate Armed Services Committee. But Libya, of course, is a failed state. In the Middle East, in the greater Middle East, proxy groups backed by Iran with aspirations to become a regional hegemon have been rewarded with billions of dollars in sanctions relief and a deeply flawed deal, putting it on a pathway to a nuclear weapon. In Afghanistan, the Taliban eagerly awaits the opportunity to fill a vacuum that will be created by an arbitrary timetable of troop withdrawals that the administration has promised. There seems to be no limit to the worldwide ramifications of U.S. retreat. Not just Russia, not just China, not just Iran, but people all around the world are noticing our reluctance to defend our interests around the world. And sadly, our friends abroad have also been put on notice. Longtime allies and partners have been given a cold shoulder. Instead of rising to the challenge, the absence of U.S. leadership has made our alliances more fragile than many of us would like to admit. So when America retreats, when we draw red lines and we refuse to enforce them and snub allies like Israel, our credibility is damaged and our reliability as an ally is suspect. What's worse, this retreat doesn't appear to be part of any particular larger strategy. It's just simply an abdication of American leadership. Well, I know I've painted a pretty bleak picture, but as we look to the next administration in 2017, it's important to take note of what is not working. I believe in the endless capacity of the American people and the leaders who lead us to learn from our mistakes, to make mid-course corrections, and make things better. But the next administration must have a strategic vision and be willing to use every tool in the toolbox to protect our national interests. The Cold War may seem like a distant memory compared to today's world of diverse global threats, but one clear lesson we can take from the Cold War is that developing and executing a strategy works. Developing and executing a strategy works. One of the reasons the world seems to be on fire today is because the administration doesn't seem to have, the United States government as a whole, does not seem to have a comprehensive strategy to guide the foreign policy goals of the United States. Believe me, if it's not obvious to me from where I stand and where I get up and work every day, I think about the perspective of our friends and adversaries. It must be even more opaque to them. I think the situation playing out in Syria today provides a startling example. It's not just in Paris, but the whole world has recoiled when terrorists connected to ISIS targeted innocent civilians in a soccer stadium, a concert hall, and a cafe. No, ISIS is not the JV team, nor has it been contained, as the president has claimed. Over a year ago, I and others, when we were talking about the president was seeking an authorization for the use of military force to go into Syria, we asked, please tell us what your strategy is, and where he'd already drawn a red line. There were a lot of us asking the president, begging the president, imploring the president, please tell us what your strategy is for success. Again, learning from some of our mistakes, I remember General Petraeus making the remark that one of the most important questions to ask when you engage in armed conflict or when you're contemplating that is, how does this end? How does this end? The president has stubbornly and irresponsibly, in my view, refused to provide us that strategy. What we've seen and heard instead are speeches, interviews, and assurances designed to essentially change the subject and to change the subject from the sort of scrutiny that I think it deserves on what the so-called strategy in ISIS is and why it doesn't seem to be working. One problem, it seems to me, is that the president seems to be confusing strategy with tactics. How a strategy might be accomplished and what that effective strategy looks like. Military leader after military leader have told us that bombing missions alone will not defeat ISIS. And not even the most elite special forces in the world, America's special forces, are designed to hold ground once it's cleared. It takes conventional forces to hold that ground. And over the last year, the administration's paralysis in Syria has seen it plunge further and further into violence and chaos. We've seen millions of Syrians and Iraqis displaced internally and living in refugee camps that I've visited in Turkey and Jordan, Lebanon, and of course now they're escaping to Europe and beyond. And over the course of many months, we've seen ISIS carve out a safe haven in the heart of the Middle East. I thought if there was one lesson we learned from 9/11 is don't let terrorists carve out a safe haven. Yet they have. The failure of a clear strategy that guides our foreign policy is unfortunately not limited to the Middle East. It applies to all of the hot spots that I've noted. And my point is simply this. We cannot afford to make it up as we go along. We cannot just respond to each conflict in an ad hoc manner because it's dangerous. Waiting to see what each new day brings, hoping that our enemies will give up or destroy each other is not just poor strategy, it's naive and it's dangerous. Given the rapidly evolving security environment, we must not just react, but we must lead as dynamic events develop around the world. Of course, we need to make sure that our military has the resources it needs to get the job done. And I think we've taken our eye off the ball in recent years. We must have a realistic and honest fiscal approach to funding and equipping our military. I mean, if there's one job the federal government is supposed to perform, it is protecting our national security. And I find it disturbing that although we're facing the most diverse set of threats perhaps in our nation's history, our military budget simply doesn't reflect this reality. In fact, we're just spending a fraction of the federal budget on our military compared to the early years of the Cold War. I know we'd like to cash the peace dividend, but there is no peace. Any objective observer would have to be forgiven in concluding that national defense is just simply not that high on our priority list, at least not as high as it was back then, and I find that deeply troubling. Recent cuts to the defense budget have hobbled our military by any measure, and I think sent a demoralizing message to our allies and to our men and women in uniform. Conversely, I think it sent a signal to our adversaries that they are freer to assert themselves with impunity whenever and wherever they wish. So the next administration needs to work to restore the defense budget in a way that reflects the disparate, manifold threats our nation faces. To do otherwise would be to reject Reagan's dictum, which I find to be as true today as it was then. Peace through strength. If we reject that in the next administration, that would be a terrible mistake. Another president, President Eisenhower, once said, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." And it's true that while we can't reliably predict the future, we need to prepare for everything that may come our way. We just simply, in my view, do not have a choice. The next president needs to integrate all elements of national power and statecraft, not just military power, in order to promote America's indispensable leadership. One area that we can use soft power to our better advantage is through our energy policy. Earlier this year, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, said, "We need to pay more and particular attention to energy as an instrument of national power." And I agree with that. And with the energy revolution right here at home, our country has the real opportunity to do exactly that. The U.S., after all, is more energy self-sufficient than ever before. Last year, the United States imported the lowest level of oil in the last 30 years, and we were the top producer in the world of oil and gas. And North America, with what Canada has, with what Mexico has, which is just in the process of beginning to be developed, we can replace the Middle East and will replace the Middle East, I'm confident, as the top oil and gas producing region in the world. Unfortunately, we do have some outdated policies that need to change because they deny us the ability to export that energy around the world. This not only hurts our domestic energy producers who receive a discounted price, not the world price, for their product, but it negatively affects our allies as well and enables our enemies to use energy as an instrument of coercion. By making American energy readily available to the world market, we could help our friends and partners who are pleading for access to U.S. energy so they can diversify their resources. And importantly, we could simultaneously reduce their dependence on countries like Russia and Iran. In doing so, we can weaken the hand of some of our most powerful and dangerous adversaries and underscore our commitment and support for our allies abroad. This is just one other way how the next administration could help restore some of the United States' credibility around the world. When people argue for greater U.S. engagement, we often hear critics say that America doesn't have the appetite to be the world's policeman. Yes, America can't afford to be everywhere at all times, but we have to recognize and accept, and I believe embrace, that we have an indispensable and unique role in the world. As a guarantor of security to a significant portion of the developed world, and as a necessary deterrent to the thugs, tyrants, and other troublemakers and enemies of peaceful coexistence. Nobody else can do that. A few years ago, Charles Krauthammer made a similar point when he said that America was the closest thing to what he called a centralized authority, to an enforcer of norms, who answers the call and that does not shrink from leading. One of the key challenges of the next administration will be to demonstrate that once again, in the future, our allies will have no better friend and our adversaries will have no worse enemy than the United States of America. And similarly, the next administration must make clear that we will use every tool available to us, every measure of statecraft, whether it's diplomatic, economic, or military, to engage and lead the world around us. The next president could, for example, do that by defining our actual interests in Syria, formulating a viable strategy to protect them, and playing a leading role to unite an international coalition to restore stability and eradicate ISIS. That administration could foster deeper diplomatic and economic ties with our partners in East Asia and make clear our commitment to them in the face of Chinese hegemony, and reinforce our relationships with our European allies, including giving them energy flexibility so that Russia can't use energy as a weapon. Well, as you can tell, I think the next administration and Congress have a lot to do. The United States must restore our credibility and once again assume our critical role in the world as an unflinching ally and an unrivaled military power. By doing so, I believe the world will be more peaceful and more prosperous. Thanks for letting me share a few thoughts with you today, and I'm happy to join my friend Admiral Inman in answering a few questions. Thanks a lot.
That was a wonderful start for this last part, Senator Cornyn. And you've covered already so many of the things I would have asked questions about. So I'm going to try to zero in on it. And if you're willing, let's start with the U.S. We've got to have an economy that's growing and functioning if we're going to be able to play the leadership role in the world. You've already touched on energy briefly. What are the prospects for legislation to remove the embargo on oil?
Well, we're getting mixed signals from the administration. We're told that in order to lift that export ban, would have to agree to further subsidies for renewable energy, for example. Some things that, while I'm for all the above, I think some of that represents bad policy. For example, I do think it's important that the government encourage innovation in the energy space, but at some point, the taxpayers got to be let off the hook and let those different forms of energy make it on their own. So I'm hopeful that we can include this as part of the end-of-year package. We've got a number of things to do, three main things to do before we leave for Christmas. One is a multi-year highway bill. A second is a group of tax extenders. And then the third is the omnibus appropriation bill that has to be done by December the 11th. The other part that I didn't talk about that I ought to give some credit to the administration, they have approved, of course, a number of LNG export facilities that have been tremendous investments that I think do help. But I think we need to go all the way and lift the export ban on crude.
The bulk of my adult life, we've had negative balance payments. And the prospect of what being an energy exporter could do for that just seems to me so obvious.
Well, I'm a big free trader, and you know, my job is the whip. My job is to count votes, and I not only count Republican votes, I count the Democratic votes, and we work closely with the administration to pass trade promotion authority because the Trans-Pacific Partnership represents about 40% of the world's GDP, and why not open up export markets to Texas and the United States? I think it's good for the economy, good for everybody. So it does seem to be a bit of a contradiction to say we're for free trade and exporting except when it comes to oil. So I hope we can work our way through it.
Let me add just on top of that, Keystone Pipeline. Export of that oil derived out in Alberta is critical to the Canadian economy.
Yeah.
We want to maintain that great close relationship. The Chinese have offered to build a pipeline through the Canadian Rockies out and guarantee that they would be the market for it, which we seem reluctant to do.
Well, it seems like the attitude is if we don't do this, nobody else will. But to your point, somebody will buy that crude. And I think it also ignores the fact that there's a lot of it already coming down on trains and tankers, which is a whole lot more dangerous and not as efficient as a pipeline. I think I went through this experience a few years back and just Googled oil and gas pipelines in America. And it looks like a big bowl of spaghetti. I mean, they're everywhere. But most of the time they operate without us knowing where they are because they just simply operate efficiently and safely. And I just think it was a mistake.
Let me take you into more treacherous terrain, and that's the issue of immigration. In all of its, right now it seems to be focused almost entirely on security of Syrian refugees, but it's a much larger issue of talent, attracting bright talent, letting them stay in the process. Border security is important, but would you sort of address in the
Sure.
broader framework where you see the immigration problem going?
Well, you know, we often say we're a nation of immigrants, and it happens to be true. All of us, our families came from somewhere else with very few exceptions, unless you're a Native American, I suppose. But particularly, you mentioned the brains that we attract to our colleges and universities. I mean, we have the best higher education in the world. And the reason I know that is because everybody wants to come here and go to school. And then we turn them back and say, you got to go home and compete with us. And I just think it makes no sense. So I've long been a supporter of revamping the H-1B visa, and I think we just need to look at immigration programs like Canada and others where they actually assign more credit to people that have greater skills they're bringing. I know that some people would like to open our immigration system simply to unskilled labor, and there's a justifiable concern. I mean, we need people to work. We need Americans to work first. But if there's not Americans that can hold those jobs, then we ought to consider a legal system whereby others can help. But right now, we tend to favor the low-skilled immigrant under our current system. And by the way, the United States, I look at the refugee debate, and we already naturalize almost 1 million people a year in the United States. I mean, don't let anybody tell you that the United States isn't the most generous country in the world when it comes to accepting people through a system of legal immigration. But I think the biggest problem we have, Admiral, is the fact that the public's just simply lost confidence in the federal government. The president's executive action, which essentially defied the law that on the books and said, I'm going to do it myself, which now has been enjoined by the federal courts and upheld at the Fifth Circuit. I just think all of that sort of eats away at confidence. So I think Speaker Ryan said he's happy to work with the president on almost anything other than immigration, because I think there's just no confidence there in that relationship. But we can get that back in 2017 and beyond, and we must. We know in Texas, we've got to deal sensibly with our border. We need border security, but 6 million American jobs depend on binational commerce and trade.
Let me take you a step further on this one, because you hit it. What worries me greatly, the declining public support for the role we're going to play in the world.
Yeah.
My own view is that's because we haven't defined
I agree with that.
what role we're going to play in the process. So how do we go about trying to regain broad public support for U.S. leadership in the world?
Well, nobody's got a better bully pulpit than the President of the United States. And President Obama, I don't think really believes that America should play that role. And he points to the long wars we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq and the public's understandable reluctance to continue to spend American blood and treasure fighting foreign wars. But there is, as I tried to point out in my remarks, just no real alternative to American leadership. We can and need to do a better job of eliciting coalitions of other governments, people in the region that have a self-interest to try to deal with the issue, like combating ISIS. But most of the militaries in those countries, as I think you'll agree with me, they weren't built to project power overseas or outside of their country. They were built just purely as self-defense. And you look at India, for example, with a huge military, Egypt and others, those would be some examples of that. So I just think we need that leadership that only a president can provide, and that's what I hope that debate will be part of the presidential election process. And then the next president will have a mandate to step up and provide that leadership.
Simply underlining your point. I've got a lot of friends scattered around the world from my multiple careers, and I talk to them fairly often and ask, how do they think things are going? Inevitably, they all come back and say, well, where's the U.S.? What's the U.S. going to do? Right. So I stop and say, how would you define the U.S. today? Indecisive. That's the answer I get repeatedly, no matter what part of the world that I ask about. So next president's got a big
Decisive and lead.
To turn.
If you don't want to do that, you shouldn't run for president. Yeah. I don't blame some of our friends around the world when they see our presidential election primaries on both sides. Yeah. Kind of wonder what in the heck is going on.
Yeah. It's at least a big reality show. In coming back around, you laid out the challenges you got now before the end of the year. We unhappily have a long history. At the end of a conflict, we draw down our military pretty precipitously. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the intelligence budget's hidden inside that defense budget, so it's normally taken down with it. Where was the dividend for the end of the Cold War? And so suddenly when we get the first attack on U.S. soil at the World Trade Center in '93, there was no addition of resources to go try to understand that and track the cause. It was shuffle what you got, give up some other coverage in order to do it. And I would argue that contributed to the surprise of the attack on the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in '98 and on to 2001. So my question to you, I fear I see this same thing repeating itself with sequester at a precise time that we need to be going the other direction, increasing our capabilities to be a leader in the world?
Well, I remember after 9/11, what you said. You said that this is a failure of imagination. We just didn't have people that imagined that somebody might actually hijack planes and fly them into the World Trade Center. It was just such a bizarre way to attack the United States, but so effective from a terrorism and from a public reaction standpoint. But, you know, we do have a short-term memory, so we need to be reminded. America has always risen to the challenge and will again, despite the rather pessimistic portrait that I painted just a few moments ago. We will do it. I mean, if I didn't think we had the capacity to do it, given the right leadership and the right policy, I would go do something else. But I believe in that. But to your point about sequester, this a little reminder, 2011, of course, the president and the opposing party, my party, Republicans, we were fighting about spending. And so basically what we agreed to do was pass something called the Budget Control Act, create a group of 12 people called the Super Committee. 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats are going to come up with a grand bargain to deal with discretionary spending and mandatory spending, which, as you know, is 70% of the federal budget. Well, the fallback, and actually the president's folks suggested this, was sequestration, automatic caps on discretionary spending. And we agreed to do that because nobody dreamed that it would ever happen. And then it did. And then that got to be the only way to rein in or control spending at the federal level because there was no grand bargain. So I think it was, I understand how it happened, but I think, again, as I said earlier, our responsibility, my responsibility, is to make sure that that our national security interests are provided for. And there's a lot of stuff the federal government does that is not a priority in my view, but that's number one. Nobody else can do it. So that's why we entered into this budget negotiation here the last few weeks, which actually raised discretionary spending, including defense spending. The part of the deal, the negotiation, since nobody gets everything they want, I would have just raised the military cap and leave the non-defense discretionary spending flat, but we couldn't do that because it was a negotiation and with trade-offs.
And looking at the challenges out in front of us, trying to understand what Russia's doing, where Russia's going to go, what China's going to do, the Middle East, the ISIS, the plate's very full.
Absolutely.
Challenges. You touched briefly on China. The current focus has been on making sure that they can't claim the entire South China Sea as a China lake by building some islands along the way. What's your reaction to how we've dealt with that problem to date?
Well, I was in August when I was with a group of senators and congressmen. We visited, I mentioned Admiral Harris at Pacific Command, and then we went on to Australia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And so we talked a lot about the South China Sea and what China was up to. They built, I think, a 10,000-foot runway on the Spratly Islands down there, in one of these old barrier reefs that they've dumped a bunch of sand on. And I don't think you need a 10,000-foot runway for just commercial aviation. But I do appreciate that the Department of Defense and the United States Navy has demonstrated that the sea lanes are going to remain open, and we're not going to back off from that. So I just think we need to work even more closely with our allies in the region and work jointly to have those patrols to demonstrate that China can't close off those sea lanes, which are so important to international trade and travel.
In my interactions with China over the last 3 or 4 years, I've worked at finding areas where we can collaborate, areas where we can't. Made the point, we're never going to be allies. We don't have to be enemies.
Right.
And the issue is finding how do we find areas to collaborate, and then how do we fence those areas that we can't so that we don't end up in explosive situations.
I couldn't agree more, and you have certainly a lot more experience than I do in this area, but in my travels, my travel I just mentioned Australia, for example, I didn't fully appreciate how dependent Australia was on the purchasing of minerals and agricultural goods and other things, the trade they have with China. And so I kind of got the sense that the Australians were looking at us and saying, we don't want to have to choose between the United States and China, which I think is fine, because as you said, I think we can acknowledge the realities that where we have differences, but not assume that we are adversaries and then try to stay engaged with them and avoid those potential conflicts and hotspots.
We talk about special relationship with the UK for many years. I would argue that there's a comparable special relationship with Australia.
I agree.
Who've been with us on virtually every issue. So I take your point about their dependence. We have to take that into consideration in our own policy to make sure their economy prospers. And
absolutely, absolutely. Well, don't get me wrong. The ambassador from Australia said, we don't want to have to choose, but if we did have to choose, we'd choose the United States.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear. It was very informative to me, and I guess shows the benefit of getting outside of the Beltway and traveling to some of those places and talking to people, so you can have a better, more in-depth understanding of the complexity of those arrangements.
I know the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs described in his confirmation hearings Russia as his biggest challenge and threat, which surprised, I think, a number of people, particularly with all the focus we have on terrorism elsewhere. And the big quandary is Mr. Putin.
Right.
He doesn't like us, but beyond that, what are his objectives? Where's he going to go? And we've been so caught up on the Ukraine and Crimea, and suddenly there he is in Syria in the process.
Well, I mentioned Bob Gates earlier. I actually called him after Russia went into Ukraine, and I just said, you're an old Russian expert, and the Secretary of Defense, somebody I admire and respect, and what do you think? He said, well, when Putin sees sequestration and sees the U.S. government cutting back on its military spending, he senses that as a sign of retreat and weakness, and that emboldens him. And that's not the only thing, but it emboldens him. It is one of the things that worries me about Mr. Putin is he would love nothing better than to break NATO.
Yeah.
And when you see some of the public opinion polling out of Germany, for example, of how many of the German people believe that if Article 5 of the NATO treaty were invoked, with one NATO country attacked, all are attacked and all come to the aid of that country, the majority of people in at least one poll I saw said they would not favor Germany responding by acting as NATO against that aggression.
And there goes NATO.
There goes NATO. And Putin would love it.
Happily, Hollande elected to do the less demanding West European Union clause and not the NATO. And maybe he was afraid of what would happen in Germany elsewhere in the process. But we have to worry, I believe, if we don't respond there, what's Mr. Abe going to think in Japan about the reliability of our nuclear guarantee security treaty in Japan or in Korea?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think he understandably was upset, concerned, questioned how the Iran nuclear deal was handled. And I hope I'm wrong, but I believe Netanyahu was right when he said that we may have delayed, but we have not prevented Iranian nuclear weapons. And we may have, and indeed he said we've paved the pathway, maybe in 10 years, but maybe not today unless they just cheat, which I'm sure they were capable of doing. But the idea of a nuclear Iran, given their proxy wars against the United States and against so much, Iran has been killing Americans since the early 80s following the Iranian Revolution, whether it's at our embassies or in Iraq, or the Iranian Quds Force training people who come kill our servicemen in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So the world is a very, very dangerous place, and that's why I felt it was so important to talk about American leadership and American strength, and to be completely clear-eyed about the nature of the threats. And I wish we could live in a world where we could just retreat inside of our borders and people would leave us alone and we could prosper and pass on the blessings we have to future generations. But if nothing else reminded us that that's not possible, 9/11 should have been the most recent reminder.
Having tried to support nuclear weapons non-proliferation for 50 years and verified treaties, my worry on the Iranian deal is that we have shifted from prohibiting proliferation to managing proliferation.
I agree.
And what that says for so many of the other countries who may have ambitions or turn their way in a worry, I'm reasonably comfortable that the IEA structure can verify that they're not enriching at the known facilities. But those facilities aren't where they're going to design warheads and marry them up with missiles, and they got 25 days to move for that. And my sense is that our track record for finding clandestine efforts pretty slow. I think it took us 18 months to find the last one. So I simply worry that there are too many loopholes here.
I worry about the same thing, and I certainly defer to your experience and judgment, but it worries me a lot.
This last panel that you missed was an extraordinarily good one in looking at the history of terrorism and tracking along how things have gone. And it does take us at the end to ISIS that we have now. And what priority do we put on ISIS? I would project to you that we need to think of some different approaches, some new approaches, saying if this is the highest priority, then maybe we ought to put away some of the other quarrels and bring a collaborative effort. I think the UN would authorize the permanent members to form coalitions, plural, not single, and to go after from two different directions, trying to crush ISIS. My sense is if you do that, it will lose its attractiveness to so many of the people who are now being recruited. But that's going to go down pretty hard with some people of thinking that you might do that. And I'm not talking about putting large numbers of US troops on the ground, or Russian troops for that matter. But how do you repeat what we knew worked in 2001? When you put CIA and special forces people on the ground to do the direct support, rely on the Kurdish Peshmerga. That means in Syria, Russia would probably rely on the Syrian army. But if they're dealing with Assad and we're not in this period to crush ISIS, I can live with that. I think a lot of other people will have trouble with that approach. But my sense is we've got to recognize this is the highest priority in the near term to crush it. So,
well, Syria is, as you've alluded, is an incredibly complex environment. And if Assad were to be deposed today without some sort of transition to other leadership, the void would be filled by a lot of really bad actors. And I'm sure Michael McCall mentioned yesterday, the other threat of ISIS is not just Americans traveling or people from visa waiver countries traveling to Syria and then coming back home. It's the homegrown and radicalization of people like Major Nidal Hassan at Fort Hood in 2009.
yes.
People like the two shooters that came from Phoenix to shoot up this exhibit in Garland, Texas, that were stopped by a security guard, thank goodness. I mean, any one of these could have been like Paris. Thankfully, it's been avoided. But that's their slick use of social media and their ability to communicate and radicalize people in place. I think the FBI director said that every FBI field office in America has an open investigations on that very topic. So that ought to raise all of our attention and make sure that we don't let our guard down.
May I take you back sort of for a conclusion to hopefully a more optimistic note? We started off talking about our economy. And clearly the infrastructure is a critical part of that. Are you optimistic about a highway bill going through and giving us a surge
I
on
am.
infrastructure?
I am. But I would note that thanks to our good leadership here in Texas, we haven't waited on the federal government. Both this this November
Yes.
and the November before, or the year before, we voted to authorize transfer from the rainy day fund and also new revenue sources for transportation. But the good news is we will pass by December the 4th a multi-year highway bill. And that's the first time in a number of years. We've had 30-something temporary patches, which, as you know, is inefficient and wasteful. And nobody can ever plan from that. But I do, to a big, fast-growing state like ours, it's particularly important because we need to maintain our roads and bridges and expand our infrastructure so that we can continue to grow economically. It's so inextricably intertwined with our economic success. That's important.
In closing, let me simply thank you again for taking the time to do this. And it's simply a hallmark of the support you've long given to this. My students and I have had the privilege of having Senator Cornyn come to my class, teach along the way. And that support for the quality of higher education is enormously important to you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for all you do.
Thank you. Thank you.